All right, Alexander, we have got to talk about gas for rubles. Gas for rubles. And the fact that G7 countries, specifically Germany, has kind of taken the lead in this. They've said that they will not comply with this gas for rubles. The deadline is March 31st. So it's right around the corner. And then I guess we'll see who's going to blink first. Who
Well,
is
indeed.
who is telling the truth here? Will Germany not pay for gas for their gas in rubles, or will Russia say, "Okay, we'll accept euros," or will they turn off the taps? What do you think's going to happen here?
I don't know is the short answer, but I'm going to make one observation. I mean, the one absolute reality, the one undisputable, indisputable truth about Vladimir Putin, something which nobody can deny now, is that this man doesn't bluff. So he said last week that the Russians will only accept payment in rubles. So I'm assuming that he's not bluffing. Now, if he's not bluffing because that's his background, then I presume the gas will be switched off on the 31st of March, in which case we are in serious trouble. And I think that perhaps the extent to which we are in serious trouble is not understood.
Well, who's we? Who's we?
I
Who's we?
mean the Western, the Europeans first and foremost, but potentially, dare I say it, the United States, the whole world. Because before we did this program, I sent you an article from the Financial Times. Now, the Financial Times, I should say, is a militantly anti-Putin newspaper. It reproduces every fantastic story about the war. We were discussing an equally fantastic story about the progress of the negotiations. But at the same time, it has to provide a service to the business community. And business people do need, from time to time, accurate analysis about what's going on. And that's why from time to time, it's the Financial Times that provides us with accurate updates about the actual situation on the battlefront. And they've just now done that with the gas. And what they've shown is that all the talk about replacing Russian gas is simply utopian, at least as far as Europe is concerned. Europe consumes 500 billion cubic meters of gas every year. Much of it, it produces itself. But European natural gas production is falling. They've been increasing their imports of Russian natural gas. Russia exports around 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Europe every year. That's around 40% of the natural gas that Europe consumes. There is no substitute for it. This announcement, wasn't even a deal, this announcement that Biden and Ursula von der Leyen made last week about the US providing Europe with extra natural gas. It was only 15 billion cubic meters of natural gas. Now, that's just a tenth of imports from Russia, and that apparently would be extremely difficult for the US to provide on present production. If you can't, what the US would have to do if it was to add that 15 billion to the 22 billion cubic meters of natural gas it provides to Europe in any one year, if it was to actually increase the amount by that figure, it would have to divert natural gas away from its Asian customers. And that's impossible to do without raising the price. But there's a further problem, which is that even if the United States cranked up production of natural gas in some way, even if it did divert all this production from Asia, leading to higher worldwide gas prices, there is still a lack of capacity in Europe, LNG terminals, and all the rest to cope with this extra LNG gas from the United States. So it can't be provided anytime soon. Now, if Putin is serious and gas is cut off on the 31st of March. That means that as of the 31st of March, Europe is without 40% of its gas. Now, that might present problems for the Russians, but presumably they've planned for this and they seem to be in a mood where they can absorb it. What does Europe do? Now, I'm hearing all kinds of plans and projects about how we reduce gas consumption, we lower our thermostats, we, reduce usages of gas. All this is wartime stuff, and it's very, very difficult to see how we can maintain a civilian economy across Europe if the Russians simply switch the taps off in that kind of way. So we just have to wait and see. I mean, do the Russians need to sell the gas more, or do we need to buy it more? Clearly, in Europe, we need to buy it. The only question is, do the Russians need to sell it? And I repeat again that Vladimir Putin is somebody who doesn't bluff.
Yeah. Robert Habeck, he's like a super minister. He's like the German minister of like economy, energy, and climate protection, and all of these things. And I think he's also like vice chancellor. He's like a super minister. Anyway, he came out with a statement, and he said that paying for the gas in rubles would be a breach of the contracts that they have in place. My question to you is, did not the EU and the US, the collective West, Germany, did they not break the contracts that they have in place with the sanctions that prevented Russia from working with euros and dollars? Number one, that's the first question that I have for you. And is there a way for Germany, let's just take Germany in this case, to circumvent this decree, this policy from the Kremlin by somehow paying for the gas in euros and then having Gazprom Bank or Sberbank convert those euros or those USD into dollars and thus going into the coffers of the Kremlin?
Well, we don't know what's going to happen on the second, but on the first, let's be absolutely clear about this. I mean, for the EU to simply say, well, this is absolutely shocking, it's a breach of contract. Sanctions are a breach of contract. That is what they are. You announce sanctions, which are not commercial actions, they're political actions, by the way. But you announce sanctions, you seize money from the money of a central bank, which is a default, by the way. Always remember that. You cancel Nord Stream 2, which is a breach of contract as well. I mean, didn't even complete its certification process. You do any number of things like that. All of these are breaches of contract. It's fascinating to see how Europeans and Westerners suddenly discover the sanctity of contracts when it applies to them, but don't worry about the sanctity of contracts when it applies to others. I remember so well Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, when the United States was mumbling at that time about sanctioning a Russian gas pipeline, coming along and saying contracts are sacred. They are enforceable against you, just as you can enforce them on others. You do not interfere with contracts, claiming that what you're doing is sanctions, and then assume that this is somehow a legal way of evading your contractual obligations. So yes, the West has breached its contracts with Russia. It's defaulted on its obligations to Russia. And now, of course, the Russians are preparing to do the same to the West. And, of course, the West doesn't like it, and they're complaining about contracts. But, of course, it was they who initiated this. Now, what the Europeans do in this situation, I simply don't know. Whether they can find some way round, I'm not absolutely sure. I don't really see how paying Gazprom back money in euros and having Gazprom bank then convert it all into rubles. I'm not quite sure how that works exactly and why that would comply with this Kremlin decree. I mean, it doesn't seem to me to make any sort of sense, actually. But of course, from their point of view, from the European point of view, their massive concern must be that, of course, if they do pay for this gas in rubles, then the most eye-catching part of the sanctions is suddenly being left completely meaningless. Because at that point, if they're paying for the gas in rubles, the ruble in effect becomes a hard currency. So the freezing of the central bank's reserves suddenly becomes, or suddenly looks like it's become a lot less important. And of course, if the Russians are going to say, well, since you're paying us in rubles, we don't want you to use the SWIFT interbank payment system anymore. From now on, you'll be sending your payments through our interbank messaging system, the SPS or whatever it's called. Well, then, of course, as I said, the most important of the sanctions suddenly look meaningless. And of course, that's not what the Europeans want to do, which is why at the moment they're feverishly running around hoping that, in fact, what Putin is saying is simply a bluff. I don't think he's bluffing. As I said, I've never seen this man bluff. He's not bluffed over the last few months. I think this is absolutely for real. And as I said, on the 31st of March, we'll see what happens and what the Europeans do.
Yeah, like 4 weeks ago, say 3-4 weeks ago, the Europeans were bragging about how they've sunk the ruble, and the ruble is like at 140, 150, and they were going
Which
all
was
over
already
the place, media
which
channels.
which was already disappointing from their point of view, by the way. I think that they were
Yes,
expecting a far, far bigger collapse than happened. I mean, it never went into free fall as had been expected. But anyway, that's another story.
Well, Biden
yeah.
did brag about it during his State of the Union as well. I think he said
Absolutely.
40%. The ruble's devalued something like 40%, and everyone was clapping. Oh my God, this is incredible. We've sunk the Russian economy. I think today the ruble is at like 90, 89, 90, 91. So I mean that's completely collapsed. Now, if they have to pay for the gas in rubles, I imagine that the ruble is just going to strengthen even more. I wouldn't be
Absolutely.
surprised if it goes back to 80. I really would not be surprised.
I'm not going to guess, but I'm sure you're
you
right.
wanted to say something?
No, I'm sure you're right. I don't want to guess where it will go. But
I can't
I'm
predict
sure you're
this,
right.
but,
I can't predict this exactly. But I'm sure you're right, and I'm sure. And I also, by the way, what I'm hearing is that domestic inflation in Russia is actually now. It surged at the end of February, at the beginning of March, but now it's falling back because domestic production, especially of foodstuffs, is starting to kick in. So it's not worked out as expected. But if they have to pay in rubles, it's not just that the Russian economy won't crash. It's that, as I said, their sanctions are in effect cancelled. I mean, it would essentially cancel the biggest, most eye-catching part of the sanctions. And of course, if they don't pay in rubles and the Russians aren't bluffing and the gas is stopped, well, the West European economy is in very serious trouble, and that's going to affect the United States as well, where Biden's ratings are again plunging, where 71% of Americans say the country is going in the wrong direction, and where there is, I suspect, a growing lack of confidence or loss of confidence in the administration and its leadership. And by the way, I'm starting to see more and more criticisms of Biden starting to appear in the British media as well. I mean, there was an article in the Daily Telegraph, of which there is no more fervid an opponent of Russia and of Putin. The most grotesquely ludicrous stories about the war, about the Ukrainian victories, appear in the Daily Telegraph. But even the Daily Telegraph had to say that Biden's trip to Europe was a train wreck.
Oh yeah, it was a complete train wreck, and you don't see Biden or the Biden White House or Ursula von der Leyen in the EU talking about where the ruble is now, do you? They've shut up about it, completely shut up about it. Yes, and it's not only a problem of quantity. It's not only the fact that that the U.S. or any country, they just can't fulfill the quantity that's needed for the European Union. There's the question of reliability. You're talking about LNG as opposed to just sending the gas via a stable, secure pipeline. Big difference there. Reliability, stability, predictability, which is something a business needs. A business needs to know that this cost is fixed, it's going to be reliable, it's not going to be variable, and it's going to be cheap, not only for a business, but for the consumer. Even, even if the US can pick up some of the slack, Europe is going to have to tell their citizens and their businesses, yeah, okay, we'll make it by. Maybe we'll have some, we'll have to take cold showers, or your business will have to work Monday to Thursday and shut down on Friday. Whatever they come up with, it still is not going to change the price that they're going to have to pay on top of the cutbacks, which is going to be 10, 20 times more. So you have that issue. And finally, I want to ask you, why? Why should Russia even think about accepting payment in any commodity in euros or USDs? Because number one, it's useless to them. What are they going to do with euros or USD? They've been cut off everywhere. For them, holding a dollar at this moment in time is like it's like holding a piece of paper, an empty piece of paper, a blank sheet of paper. It's meaningless. And even going further than that, why should they accept any payment in reserve currencies, especially USD and euro, given the fact that the trust has been broken with the collective West? It's like saying, you know what, we'll pay you in USD, but we'll probably confiscate that USD in about 2 weeks' time anyway, because they've already done it. So I don't see any upside for Russia to come to some sort of accommodation with Germany or the European Union or the US for that matter.
I happen to agree with you. I mean, if you go to Russia apparently today, it is an entirely ruble-based economy now. I mean, it's almost impossible to convert rubles into dollars and euros, which I suspect, by the way, is one major reason why the ruble has strengthened, because people in Russia have to use it. So why wouldn't the Russians insist that payment to them is in rubles, since it is the only currency, as you rightly say, or at least the major currency now that they can use? They can use, obviously, RMB, Chinese RMB, they can use rupees, but why shouldn't they use the ruble? I happen to agree with you. I think this makes complete sense. And of course, it's obviously, again, something that wasn't thought through. But, think about it. If the ruble strengthens, if it becomes, in effect, a globally tradable currency, which, to be very clear, if West Europe has to pay for natural gas in rubles, it would instantly become that. If it becomes a globally tradable currency, then everything changes. I mean, take the case, for example, of Russian debt repayments. The Russians say that they would pay in rubles. And up to now, that's been ridiculed, and people say, well, we're not prepared to accept payment in rubles. But, of course, if the ruble is now internationally convertible and a valuable currency to hold because it's become a globally traded currency like the USD, the euro, the pound sterling, the Japanese yen, well, perhaps people would want to accept rubles in return for their debt obligations. You can see the ramifications of this, and it's absolutely clear that the Western powers never thought it through, and they don't really know, I think, what to do. I mean, you mentioned Robert Habeck. I mean, one of the most depressing things is the extent to which Germany has an economics minister who is at the moment totally out of his depth. I mean, I still shudder at his trip to Qatar, where he went to Qatar and announced that he had a long-term deal with the Qataris to buy LNG. And, the Qataris said, no, I mean, this isn't true. I mean, they contradicted him. I mean, this had no reality to it. So we are dealing with European leaders at every level of the political system, both in Brussels and in national governments, who are disastrously out of touch with economic realities and who don't obviously understand how markets work, how businesses work, how industries work, what is necessary to keep supply chains moving, what is necessary to keep energy moving, why businesses need, as you correctly said, predictable energy costs. Clearly, they don't understand any of this, and they're now being found short. And as I said yesterday, we had a report from the Bank of England warning the British people, and of course it's going to be worse in Europe, that they're going to face an unprecedented squeeze on living standards this year. And all for what?
All for what? The country, once again, I always repeat this. Doesn't matter what side you're on in this conflict. If you're an EU citizen, if you're in a country that's in the European Union, you always have to ask yourself, why are we going to suffer for a country that is not in the European Union?
Well, indeed.
I mean, that is a very basic question, and I'm not trying to take away from what's going on in Ukraine or the suffering in Ukraine or the war. I'm speaking specifically on as people who live in the European Union who have to ask themselves, or will ask themselves, I imagine in 6 months, why is all of this happening for a country that is not a member state?
Well, indeed. Well,
why are we doing this?
Well, indeed. I mean,
And that comes to my final question to you. Why? Why is Germany doing this? Why is the EU doing this?
Yeah, well, because they all got hitched onto this bandwagon, which was regime change in Moscow. I mean, this is what they were all up for. I mean, I'm sure there's been discussions about this for some time, actually, at various levels. But clearly that's been the plan all along. And they massively underestimated both the effects and the impossibilities. And they didn't really think through the Russian responses. But of course, this was a decision by the elites.
Why go after Russia?
Well,
Yeah. Why go after Russia like this?
Why did you?
I think that's
Yeah. Why did Europeans? I mean, you can understand why the US would. Why did the Europeans do it? Well, because the Europeans, I think it's fair to say, across Europe, we find this ideological grouping within the EU, which is also viscerally hatred, loathes Russia, loathes Putin, and got blinded by those ideas because, of course, they want to see Putin go because they think that they can then get unrestricted access to Russian natural resources. I mean, I suspect this is ultimately what it's all been about all along. And of course, what they realise now is what the risk they now face is that they will be cut off from those resources entirely, which will leave them in a very, very difficult economic position. But, just to go back, just a few weeks ago, the Russians were asking for two things, essentially. A commitment that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO. Well, we've all but said that Ukraine is never going to join NATO. So what was difficult about confirming that? And Ukraine's fulfillment of the Minsk agreement, which, in theory, all Western governments had signed up to and said they supported. So we've destroyed the European economy and done massive damage to the Western economy, and we've put people all around the world in positions of incredible hardship, even though we had a very simple and straightforward off-ramp, and all on behalf of a project of regime change in Moscow, which has now been accepted, I think, is unachievable. By the way, just to finish on this, I mean, I think Biden's speech that he made in Warsaw, I think it was scripted some weeks ago. And I think the intention was that he would go to Warsaw, make this speech. The ruble would indeed be trading at 200 rubles to the dollar and perhaps worse. Things would be falling apart. And that would be when he would make, if that was the context in which he would make that speech. It hasn't turned out that way. Things have turned out completely differently. And the result was that the speech, far from being a victory speech, as I think it was expected to be, has, on the contrary, sown massive alarm in Europe and around the world, and even in the United States itself.
And this is just about gas. We haven't even
This is
talked
just
about
about
ruble
gas.
payments
We haven't
for
talked about
fertilizer, wheat,
wheat,
oil,
oil,
you name it.
metals, diamonds. I mean, neon gas. I mean, everything you can imagine. And by the way, I saw that the Taiwan company that makes my semiconductors are now saying that they will try to maintain some kind of scientific cooperation with the Russians. Presumably, they need the neon gas and the metals.
Yeah, what happens in Germany when the people start to realize what's happened? When this euphoria, this Ukraine, Slava Ukraine euphoria, when this ends and it fades away, as it will undoubtedly will, and the people start to wake up to the reality. What's going to happen in
I
Germany?
think there is a reasonable chance, a good chance that the government will disintegrate, the German government will disintegrate, and we could, in theory, see a new coalition led by Friedrich Merz of the CDU, who's a much more grounded figure than these bizarre people in the present German government. He could conceivably take over, and for all I know, he could forge a new coalition with the Free Democrats, who are part of the current coalition, but seem to be increasingly uneasy by the way things are going, and perhaps conceivably, possibly even with the AfD. It might be the thing that finally brings the AfD in from the cold. But that's possible, but we'll just have to wait and see.
All right, we will leave it there. Everybody, the Duran.locals.com. And if you're watching this from Rumble, you will see a button right up top on the web browser, which will take you directly to our locals community. Click on that button. It's like a red maroon button. It'll take you right to our locals community where we have all kinds of great content from ourselves as well as community members, just posting all kinds of great content and breaking news. And it's just a fantastic community. And the Duran shop, 10% off when you use the code Good Day. And there is the Good Day mug. Take care.